Hello, everyone. Ashley McFarlane here again from the American Malting Barley Association. I filmed just this very short update to the slides that you've already viewed, just to provide a bit of a production update from when I first recorded that presentation back in 2022. So I try to provide a little supplemental information that's most timely and relevant for the information you need. So first of all, I want to start with more of a global outlook on barley production. So I believe that the original slides that were presented were from 2018, and this data, keep in mind, does not get updated every single year, hence why you're seeing barley production 2022 here. But what I did think was important to note, there's not a lot of significant changes, but definitely saw increased production from both Brazil and Argentina, so down in South America. That was really the only kind of notable change from that data that you saw previously. Of course, there's been a lot of conflict throughout Europe, significant drought conditions in various places, both North America and Australia over the years. But just kind of from a global perspective, the only big change that I'm seeing from 2018 was really this increase in production down in South America. So something definitely to keep your eye on. So hopping now, just kind of focusing on North America, and specifically, I'll start with Canada. As I had talked about previously, each year, the American Malting Barley Association puts out a list of recommended varieties, and so too does Canada. And CMBTC is who produces that list. And so I wanted to highlight just a few things for their 24-25 recommended list. So the varieties that were on last year all remain, nothing was dropped, but they did add CDC Churchill. So you can see this in the middle column of this chart, where CDC Churchill is kind of classified as a developing variety in terms of export demand, but then both domestic demand and production is growing. And so when you're thinking about varieties, perhaps CDC Churchill is something you might see if you're sourcing malt out of Canada, and perhaps could even see it here domestically in the US. Down below, I'll just point to this. You can also find a lot of more intel on these varieties, specifically from growing regions and year to year. So I just recommend, if this is something you want to take a deeper dive in, certainly go out to the Canadian Malting Barley Technical Center, and they keep this data updated on there. We want to look at barley production and then also average barley yield. This would be across all varieties throughout Canada. These charts kind of break that down. You'll see, still you can see such a dramatic decrease in Western Canada across the provinces in 2021, and that's reflected in both production and yield. And that was primarily due to drought conditions. Although we did get a nice rebound in 2022 in Canada, they actually were fairly droughty last year in 23, even though the US didn't experience many of those same conditions. And so kind of their charts look a little different than ours, been up and down a little bit over the year. But again, just this is a nice comparison showing how production and that yield that impacts that production has changed over time. So now if we zoom into the United States, I apologize, NAS has still not produced the barley 2023 production maps by county, so not much to say here, other than I believe in the slides that you saw in the original content, you likely saw some barley production really declining here in the upper Midwest because of those drought conditions, and that certainly did rebound here in these maps. Although I do want to note that specifically in North Dakota, we saw an extreme decline in seeded acreage this past year in 2024. And keep in mind, in North Dakota, we're seeing primarily spring barley. And a lot of factors that lead to that decline, some of which I talked about in the previous slides. But of note, there is increasing competition for acreage with primarily corn and soy. In North Dakota, we also have competition with canola. And I think that a lot of those competitors, especially when we start thinking about renewable fuels, both ethanol and sustainable aviation fuel, we are definitely going to get a lot more pressure from these crops that are able to produce these sustainable fuels. And barley certainly is getting kind of pushed out because of that. And I think that's why we're seeing such a drastic decline in North Dakota. So certainly something to keep, our eyes on. North Dakota was #2 in production, has been consistently year over year, but I could see perhaps that changing. Even though Montana has the most acreage, keep in mind their yield is usually significantly lower because that's a lot of dry land acreage. So we will see how this all shakes out. Idaho still is kind of the dominant player in terms of actual production. A lot of those acres are under irrigation, and so we're seeing significantly higher yields because of that. And hopefully I'll have the 2023 map by the time we get together in person, and I can share some of that and see if these county maps reflect any of those changes. Barley areas in drought. So this is a really nice tool to take a look at how drought conditions are impacting our acreage specific to barley. And so if you see on this map, the green areas do represent where barley is produced, and the red hashed areas are where we have drought at any level. I believe this time last year, we were also about in the 30s range. If we think back to 2021, we had drought areas in the upwards of 80%. Earlier in this crop season, we actually dipped down, I believe, even into the single percentages. So we actually came into this season with relatively good moisture on hand, and that's carrying us through this season pretty well. And I think that our forecasted yields that I'll talk about soon do reflect that. I also want to break this down, though, by state, because keeping in mind it's really important to think about relevance. So even if an area like Pennsylvania is in tremendous drought, and we've got barley acreage there, but we don't see a huge amount of volume from there. So it's really looking at this chart is what helps us keep this all in perspective. And so I think it's important to do that. So a good example is the state of Minnesota. If we were looking at this chart last year, Minnesota was literally leading in terms of acreage in drought, even surpassing Washington. And now this year, the state that I live in, we are literally swimming in the moisture and actually are not registering any acreage in drought. Again, Minnesota is a relatively small acreage area, so this doesn't impact really the whole domestic supply, but just of note. Idaho is an area where actually we were very, very low in drought last year, and now we're creeping up. And again, remember, that's our #1 production state. Something also to note on this chart is really looking at the red and then the pattern tiles that we actually don't see any of those. We don't have any exceptional drought and barley acreage this year, but we do have some in extreme drought. Actually seeing that on the East Coast, in Virginia and a little bit in Maryland. Again, not a huge production area, so shouldn't impact the overall volumes of barley this year too much. But keep in mind too, barley does not mind a little bit of drought. It much rather be a little dry than wet, not only from a production and quality standpoint, but also from disease. States like Minnesota and even North Dakota, where you're seeing zero drought, we are actually experiencing significant disease outbreaks. And so having a little bit of land in drought is not the worst thing in the world when it comes to barley. It's just when it hits those extremes that we really have to worry. So I'll just finish out here by showing you all the acres harvested and yield of barley over time. And so this is just for the United States. And the green line along the bottom are the acres that are harvested. And so this is really just showing the acres planted and harvested for each crop year. And you can see pretty steady after a little bit of a decline in 21, but 22 and 23 holding relatively the same. But then when we look at yield, we have significant increases in yield, took a little dip again in 21 because of the drought conditions. But I did want to share, again, we are not finished out on our crop year for 2024, so we don't have those final numbers. But we do have again, 2024, we're seeing probably a pretty steady acreage, although we always see a dip from acres seeded to actual acres harvested. So even though we're seeing the same amount of acres planted to barley that we harvested last year. I do not expect all those acres to be harvested. I won't get into all the details on that. We can talk about that when we get together and chat if you have questions about it. But kind of the moral of the story here is that we are going to see likely a drop in actual harvested acres in 24. However, we will see likely a bit of a boost in yield. So we're looking at 72.4 bushels to the acre in 2023 and forecasting right now that to be 74.2 bushels to the acre. So that's all I have, just as kind of an update to the slides that you've already seen. Again, I would love to talk about any of these on any of these items in further detail when we get together, or feel free to reach out to me via the chat or my email that's provided in the course materials. So looking forward to connecting with you all soon. Thanks.